Introduce our moderator, Shruti. Shruti is a GIS analyst and urban planner with Gridix. She does research and analysis at the intersection of digital innovation and urban planning. She also has been a core technology committee member for multiple years now. And she was a really natural fit for this role tonight because she has an undergraduate degree in architecture. She works in the digital spaces, many different softwares, and of course she's an urban planner. So truly interdisciplinary, and we're really fortunate to have her here with us tonight. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, Daniel will be joining us. And Daniel Latorre is the founder of the Wise City, and we're very happy to have you here with us tonight. So I'll just give you a quick bio. Daniel is a product management leader. He started the digital placemaking practice at Project for Public Spaces in 2010. He rebooted community mapping product strategy at OpenCoins, co-founded a neighborhood alliance in Brooklyn, and led the initial digital experience for NYC's participatory budgeting program. He has over 20 years of tech and digital consulting experience across human-centered design, branding, ed tech, gaming, social media, product, and technology strategy. And his Wise City practice offers product and engagement consulting, capacity building, and policy advice for local leaders of all kinds seeking wise governance and wise outcomes of technology in cities. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to Daniel now. So let me know, we'll let you know when we can see your screen, Daniel.
Okay, let's try to, yeah, I can share. Let's find the screen in the app. Here we go. One second.
No worries. Great to see everyone's tiles. When we're in share screen mode, you can't really see everyone at once. But we've got a good group tonight.
Share sound. I don't know if I have sound, but I'll be sharing sound maybe.
You can see your screen.
You can. Okay, so now.
Got a lot going on there.
If I have, oh.
There we go. Now we see your slides.
Do you see the main slide or like the presenter view?
Presenter view, I believe.
Damn it. One second. What about now?
Perfect, let's go.
Okay. Lost my cursor. Whoop.
What would be a tech talk without a few technical difficulties?
This is our pandemic reality, you know, using a business conferencing thing for trying to replace normal socializing. 25 minutes here. So I'm going to try to breeze through a lot of stuff that maybe some of you are quite familiar with, so we can get more to the present topics that are very much on my mind in the sort of pandemic thoughts about this ongoing sort of really lifelong mission that I have about bringing wisdom into this question of technology in cities. So first of all, remember this. I mean, when I was putting this together, I was looking at different slides that I've used, and I probably wasted like 10 minutes lost in thought looking at this image of like, my body feels like I don't remember, you know, this feels so distant. And then also excited about what this is going to feel like when we can do this again. And for, I think, a lot of us, this is what this is all about, is the reason why we got involved in city work in whatever dimension that we're working in is because of the social connectedness, the human connectedness that we've experienced here in whatever city that we happen to be in, or in travels where we've experienced other places. So think about whoops. I can't see my cursor. Yeah, so just think about, take notice right now in your body, like how you feel about this photo, and where you feel it in your body, and those sensations, because part of what I think is really important is to always be connecting to what we feel in this, because so much of this whole discussion about technology and cities, smart cities, the future, and all of this stuff is we're stuck in our heads, and partly what I want to talk about is how that's the problem. So why is the cursor not working? Okay, whoa.
Oh, it seems to be working now.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, there's my cursor. Hold on.
There might also be in I think you also have an annotate feature that might be over complicating things.
Yeah, I'm just okay. Now I have my cursor. My arrow keys are working. So here's a thing that I would normally be doing in person, and given the time constraints, I've been testing this out on Zoom, where we sort of like go to like one side or the other, right? But here's a question, and maybe you can think about where you land on this, of this assumption that technologists understand technology. Do you agree with that statement? Do you disagree? Where do you fall within that statement? And then another one here is project teams I'm a part of are as diverse as communities today or in the next 10 years. Is that your current reality? Do you agree that that's currently your work situation, or do you disagree that this is not the case? The reason why I ask this, of course, is because a lot of city planning departments, technology companies and whatnot look nothing like the people that they claim to be serving. And when you think about the embodied reality of consciousness and awareness, I want to connect this even deeper to the significance of that. It's not just about the look. It's not about the token appearance of diversity. It's about the body, mind, potential and talent, and unknown ideas that are not being tapped, because too often this isn't the case. So one of my provocations that I offer is that this 21st century public space reality in cities is too important and too complex to leave their design to IT engineers. And there is so much trapping us into that thought. There's a whole public inertia with the sort of celebration and worship of the engineer as, God, right? Elon Musk will save us, right? And variations of this. Bitcoin will save us, right? There's a very blind, almost cult-like understanding of technology, or expectations or assumption about technology, which is actually incredibly reductionist, compared to those of us that have done any form sort of urban studies or anthropology or sociology, or just have maybe spent a lot of time working in cities, and you realize, oh no, this is so much more complex than a matter of engineering of any sort. If just a reminder to mute your mic if you've just joined. Oh, I lost my cursor again. I think when someone joins, the Zoom UI layer obscures my why is it jumping? It's only going forward. Okay. So this book I can't recommend enough. Leading the Inclusive City by an urban studies professor at University of West England. And in the last chapter, which is called From Smart Cities to Wise Cities. So this is a sort of sibling connection intellectually, I feel. He has this statement that the evidence that smartness is building more inclusive cities is fragile, which is a very, I would say, English and polite way of saying what the rest of his book had been pointing out. So this is another thing that gives me a lot of motivation that I'm not the only one bringing some very philosophical and like categorical contest to a lot of the mainstream ideas that are motivating and driving the journalism and the education systems that we're all trapped in, that give incredible amounts of power to the technocratic utopia that has existed for a good part of modernity. And what I'm saying here is that moving fast and accelerating, there's all this urgency, but it's actually the worst thing to do if you're going in the wrong direction, right? And so how do we know that we're going in the right direction? This is this question of discernment, which is what if you think about wisdom, often you think about the skillful or wise discernment, skillful and wise judgment of something, right? Versus smart may mean, well, wow, we can figure out how to make this boat go really fast and efficient and fuel efficient or carbon efficient and all of these things, but is it actually going in any direction that we really want to? And who's we? Who's on the boat? Who's not on the boat? There's a litter sort of lessons, of major high profile lessons. The High Line, of course, one is, you could think of it as a, media and technology and physical installation on so many different dimensions. It's, the most Instagrammed public space in New York City, I think by orders of magnitude beyond Central Park. And the founders, themselves has said, if we were going to do this again, we never would do it the way we did it. So what does that, tell us about any of these other projects that are happening? And the quotable there was, about, instead of focusing on the design and the sort of gimmick, of the adaptive reuse, to think about who's in that neighborhood and what are the sort of outcomes that are going to happen, right? Because there was not that much of a focus on the outcomes of gentrification, rapid, increases in real estate, and the, lack of service or affordance for any of the folks that are living in one of the larger public housing complexes in New York City. Oh yeah, did it again. And then more recently, we had the huge debate in Toronto with the Sidewalk Labs, Smart City, the Masdar of Toronto, right? There's like, it's like, this is my joke, is like, there's just the Masdar project over and over again, dressed up in different UX, essentially. Recently with Portland and another Google spinoff dealing with transit data, another big debate there. And it's advancing, because each one of these big encounters, and especially after our Trump, well, not after, as a result of the Trump factor in American culture and the awareness of digital technology and how that has affected everything, there's more skepticism than ever. But we need a lot more, because we're dealing with profound issues of consent. What we're dealing right now with, what's rocking, New York State with the governor and sexual assault charges, allegations, and apparent photographic evidence that's quite strong. And of course, Black Lives Matters, and how that's affecting not just the US, but the whole world. And the 500 years plus of lack of consent on so many different dimensions that white people primarily can barely comprehend or struggle to comprehend. And I want to just pause here to talk about, this need that I think many of us are engaging in, is becoming more aware of white supremacy or white body supremacy. And I want to pause with just a quick mention of the work of Rizma Menachem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, which has been one of the most paradigm shifting works that I've read recently in a group, which I highly recommend reading it in a group, in just grounding this conversation and realizing that we need to, shift away from this racialized language really and to talk about the cultures that we come from, which is the much more real and humanistic way to relate to each other. Whiteness, blackness, brownness, et cetera, all those terms, those are all, racialized categories created by white supremacy logic. And it creates a lot of tension to bring this up. Sometimes you may feel your body tensing, when this conversation is brought up, and there's a reason for that. But where I'm coming from, to me, a big part of what wisdom is about compassion. And so part of the work of Wise Cities is to, how do we bring, again, the attention to the heart, to the compassion, to the embodied ease and comfort? How do we get to a place of peace at a bodily level with how we all live together? In other sessions or workshops, what I've started doing as a result is also, just like we do with pronouns, it's also good to kind of have everyone talk about, well, what cultures do they come from? Scottish, German, Norwegian, Italian, French, Madagascar, South African, Brazilian, Chinese, etc. And it creates a whole new surface of connection, a whole new way of talking to each other, because the whole idea of white itself is such a limiting identity. That is another false creation. And whose land are we on, right? So talk about, again, even deeper senses of consent, lack of consent. There's in North and South America, there's the uprising and just revival of indigenous populations, because even though there were great attempts to kill everybody, there are many tribes and ancestors who survived and continue to struggle and desire to live a thriving life. So this is not a done deal, and there's still a karma, you could say, of answering and coming to make things right about what has happened. That is, many folks are realizing, this is something that maybe is really in earnest beginning now more than ever, and may take, many, many generations. And I think many of us are now committed to that work. This is, very important because, I've also been hanging out a lot more with permaculture folks, starting from when I was doing work at Project for Public Spaces. I had a lot of permaculture people reaching out to me about community engagement and different types of technologies for that. Andrew Faust, who runs the New York Center for Bioregionalism and is one of the main sort of permaculture trainers in the US, North America. This is one of his quotes that I just love, because of what I was just explaining to you about biology. And of course, he's talking more about an awareness of the non-human life forms of plants and animals, and how do we get right by the food systems and the water systems that we all need to live on, versus this focus on technology that often obscures these stark biological needs for our safety. That is part of all the problem and the dilemma that we're in. So there's a bunch of big shifts, of course, that are happening that I've just have listed here. I think one thing that is not often talked about is we're now a 4-generation-wide society, increasingly, where that hasn't been the case. Usually there was only, 2 or 3 generations that were coexisting for the majority of human existence in the present moment. But our present moment now is wider because there's often 4 generations because of all the benefits of medical technology. In some places, we're seeing more of this. And what does that mean for participation, inclusion, vision, reflection? course, we all know about the urbanization that's been happening, the techlash, and I would say another way to phrase that positively is there's all this innovation happening in coming to good governance and regulation. There's also this background product shift where things like, now I think it's very aware for us with social audio like Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, that it's more than just the systems of like cheap publishing of content, which is how a lot of people thought about the internet in the first couple decades of the web. But it's about the design of relationships. And so I'll come back to that a bit here. The climate change, say no more. I already mentioned about number 6. And then number 7 makes everyone edgy, a lot of people edgy, because of what does that mean when the United States in particular, sort of the home of a very virulent form of white supremacy that has been copied by Nazi Germany and copied, in South Africa and other places, when this country itself shifts into a minority majority, as in racialized language, right? That's going to happen within our lifetimes, very around the corner, and it's estimated to be 2043. So this question is, what is this wise ratio for urban product development when it comes to technology? And a lot of my work is coming from digital placemaking that I started at PPS. And so I just want to give a definition for any of you who are maybe have different definitions of it, but it's really important to like name our terms these days. Like, what do we mean by that, especially in contested or heavily co-opted terms like placemaking. But this is my favorite. So it's a collaborative process, that's about shared value. And it's much more than design. It's about looking at ways to have creative patterns of use and paying a lot of attention to the physical, cultural, and social identities to support ongoing evolution. That's a pretty good definition in my book. And if you think about a lot of projects that are celebrated or talked about, or the way journalists often cover a lot of urban projects or urban technology projects, it rarely goes into any depth on all of these dimensions. Oops, there we go. So it's simply, digital placemaking is just the appropriate use of digital technology for placemaking. That's as simple as I can say it. And the key is that we have a meaty, pithy definition of placemaking. So placemaking principles, this is like an oldie but a goodie, but this is one of the best things. And I think it's just so relevant, especially in this technology conversation. Because modernism and the technocratic way is filled with so much of what placemaking is not. So I just want to highlight some of the things here is, of course, community driven and inclusive. Context specific is really important. And the counter to that is the one size fits all, which in practical terms, this is what I call the problem of like copy paste culture. Sometimes it's so easy to take an initiative somewhere else and then go just slap it in your project or city. And that may have benefits that are portable, but that act itself can also be exclusive of, in place of then talking to the locals and finding out, well, how can we maybe do this better? Or what else maybe is needed, or what is more important, perhaps. There's been a bit of debate over the past couple of days with some US and especially Canadian urbanists, placemakers and inclusive urbanist, equity-focused urbanist folks critiquing the 15-minute city coming out of, the Paris sort of definition or the Barcelona definition. With all the urgency that comes around the need to have walkable, non-car centered cities, there's a lot of specific needs here in the New World, in the colonized lands, for the reasons I mentioned before, which is why I prefaced that to this. Transdisciplinary as well. Right now there's sort of a battle, or oftentimes a seeding of power into the technology side of things by different departments because of those prior stated assumptions about what technology is, versus being really cross-disciplinary, which parallels the sort of multicultural inclusion that we need as well. So both in terms of the bodies that are involved and the skills that are involved. So another way to say this is that it's not about design and it's not about tech. Making a place is so much more than all of that. And like, it needs to be like, you need to kind of, this is like a koan, or like it's something to really sit with, because the design and engineering and tech disciplines tend to always suck away and hollow out or superficialize, what we really value about places. Another thing that I really want to talk about here, and I go into in other sort of workshops and whatnot, are about understanding how do we make decisions about media. So this is a question that comes up over and over again, and I think it's getting louder, is now that more people are realizing a lot of good skepticism about the techno-utopianism and the cyber-libertarianism that's been sort of running our democracies into the ground. There are methods that have been developed for 30, 40 years coming out of media studies, science and technology studies, media ecology, anthropology of media, anthropology of science, et cetera, that do look at the various effects that technologies have in human and non-human life. And there are rubrics. This is one of the simplest ones coming from Marshall McLuhan in 1988. And he basically says, whenever we do a technology project, you have to look at what it enhances, which is what everyone focuses on, especially the PR and marketing. And then what it takes away, what does it replace? And then what does it reverse? When you push something to the extreme, it actually leads to the opposite, right? So we have all this powerful technology that everyone says is about connection. And yet I would say we have a crisis of alienation more than ever. We have a crisis of a lack of connection because of all the superficial connection that we've been pumped with that still hits the oxytocin and other bodily realities to our existence. And then what does it retrieve, right? So like the mobile phone, between podcasting and now social audio like Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, is basically retrieving radio or retrieving storytelling, oral storytelling, in really interesting ways. There are other rubrics that have 10, 15, 70 questions you should ask about any technology effort that have been around for a long time. So a big part of my work is how to sort of put those into more practice, taking them from the sort of academic world and putting them into operational, practical terms. That's a big chunk of my work. So I'll quickly go through just what are some of the different digital placemaking related things that I've been focusing on. Digital placemaking itself, this was the first book that has talked about placemaking that came out in 2017. So again, it's this sort of niche, thing that's emerging because so many of the disciplines and the jobs that you all are doing now didn't exist before, and that's only sort of accelerating, and we need more of that versus the sort of Victorian template of our universities and city governance silos that we've been stuck with for several hundred years. So there's media facades, different sorts of screen facade treatments. There's sorts of all different types of interactive art sculptures, some that are now increasingly becoming productized that cities can buy as a sort of kit of parts and program in a semi-programmable, forms of interactivity that I was just hearing about last night on our Wise City Wednesdays Clubhouse chat from a placemaker who runs a bid in Saskatoon. It was really interesting to hear some of it was a Canadian company, I believe, too. Urban Screens, this is Federation Square in Melbourne, Australia. Hugely successful project that is like the antithesis of Times Square, or it's a vision of what Times Square could be if Times Square ever really decides to truly become the sort of the corner plaza or this public square of the planet, which is sort of what it's where that name sort of originates from, or kind of the halo that it has about it, instead of being the, incredibly violent, assault on the senses through a number of foolish decisions about technology that were made. The other thing in this is, this curator in Australia that I interviewed, and from a podcast that I'm working that's coming out as soon as I can now in 2021. She has this amazing idea. She's like, you have to have great curation, otherwise you just have a hole in the sky. And she was talking about urban screens and how do you have good programming that's interactive and participatory with the community. But this is also, there's a metaphor here for about any technology, right? If you just focus on the tech and the object and the techniques, but you're not, where's the curation? And you think about curation, you think about all those sort of human social dimensions of culture. And I really want to expand on this more, and we talk about this in the podcast episode. So look forward to that. Light projection, of course, one of my favorites. So portable, so good for experimentation, and also ripe for lots of just like carny gimmicks that get, again, copy pasted everywhere without any context. So it's a lesson in both possibilities and what not to do. All the urban screens that we see everywhere, again, with oftentimes deployed in such thoughtless ways. One of the new things that we developed when I was working in Australia back in 2017 is digital hoarding. So a way to kind of pre-visage what is coming in a place. And of course, that can be really useful when it's done sincerely. Mobile screens, augmented reality apps, Neighborland here, the Candy Chang, Dan Parham project, which actually borrowed in their early days a lot of the interface from the crowdsourcing apps that I led the development of at Project for Public Spaces. So we have a sort of sibling relationship. And digital printing, rapid digital printing. So a lot of this is on the campaign. So much of this is about the campaign, because when we're doing these projects, how are we communicating, whether it's the engagement side or the transparency in the feedback. I think there's a huge opportunity in community journalism and civic media, because journalism is going through a tremendous crisis, and they're increasingly becoming aware of the place-based benefit to that. What I call social placemaking campaigns, which is the bulk of the work that I did at Project for Public Spaces for informing master plans and or smaller projects to rapidly get more equitable and democratic participation by using online and offline engagement methods. Group decision making, still sorely, it's a big sort of weak spot, but a lot of people are trying at this. Technology often gets in the way or ends up sucking the energy out of communities. Civic crowdsourcing. And then lastly, urban analytics and all the dashboards, which I say is sort of like as a counterexample, like, yes, that's part of digital placemaking and all this smart city stuff, but it often ends up, again, distracting and sucking energy away. And then people don't pay attention to it. Or it's used as PR. It's ripe for sort of propaganda. I'm really into augmented reality. I think there's a lot of potential there. This project I did as a way
quite well
to
before kind of popping out. So hopefully people
allow people strangers to meet each other. So we made these 3D animals that relate to sort of myths about the campus at this university in Sydney. And they were big enough where you couldn't take a, you couldn't take a selfie. So you had to ask someone else. If you wanted to have like this photo like you see with the woman on the right, you'd have to ask someone else to take a photo of you with it. And then of course that's in the app, there's like a prompt to like, introduce yourself. So this was a super rapid prototype that we developed in just like 2 months or less really, in order to show how can we use some of this technology that actually still gives primacy to human connection as opposed to replacing it, which is what, Zuckerberg and others are all talking about with Oculus and all these other forms, which is, a deep sort of disrespect to the power and significance of human, connection in person. I'll skip over that. I think I'll just wrap up here with the sort of more conceptual stuff. So the here's sort of a way that a mental model and the way that I talk about the sort of the wisdom factor here in doing the digital placemaking. So the bulk of so much smart city, everything that we're dealing with, and the training just focuses on the tech or the feature. And then there are other people, coming from like the different design and UX traditions that are like, oh no, but we need design. Design will save us, right? Let's have better design process, service design, et cetera. And, there are now more critiques about UX, like, if we're improving the UX of a racist system, right? If we're improving the UX of a neoliberal, plutocratic system, if we're improving the UX of old ideas and we're just making them more palatable, like putting, sugar on the aspirin, to make it easier to swallow, there's a lot of problems with the sort of utopic ideas about design and UX. Hello. Then the other thing is, increasingly, I think now with the governance questions, there's this awareness of like paying attention to the layers of values. So the use value, the exchange value, the symbolic value. So now we're starting to get into like, again, this sort of the semiotics, the PR, the media studies, critical media studies, realities of what is it that we're doing to each other? What are we unleashing on each other, right? With all of this fanfare and VC fueled, blitzes. Because there's all these contested present contexts, which is what I sort of opened this conversation with. So to me, a wise city work needs to look at the whole picture, or a much more holistic approach, in order to be good ancestors in the way that we're using all this powerful technology. And especially in luxury cities, you could say like, this sort of remnants of Bloomberg, the 13th richest oligarch on the planet, has, created this city that has tremendous wealth, and yet also some of the worst problems on the planet. Which leads me into this last point here about libertarian individualism versus governance. So this is the big thing. So I just want to drop it to you this way, is here in the United States, there's been so much focus on the individual freedom, or freedom defined in different ways, as George Lakoff has talked about, right? It's worth going back and looking at George Lakoff's book on Whose Freedom, that was during the Bush, the second era, came out of that period. So, and we wring our hands about individual freedom, and there's all this different talks about sovereignty, personal sovereignty, and there's different versions of that, from the feminist versions that are talking about fighting and dismantling patriarchy, to the personal sovereignty or sovereign citizens movement that's all coming from the white nationalism of the 1970s, and is infected, within a lot of new age spirituality. So you have more and more people talking about personal sovereignty that is very much a reaction to the increasing calls and demand for, multicultural rights and equality. And then governance, there's been this huge governance gap, which Bianca Wiley and allies in Toronto raised so sharply and clearly in the battle for local self-determination and local governance and wiser governance in Toronto versus the Silicon Valley railroad, attempt to just force something onto a population. So this thing in placemaking, Ethan Kent has talked about this for a long time, about moving to a place-led approach, which is this more holistic approach versus project versus discipline, or place sensitive, which often is ripe for a lot of PR and tokenism. And the way that I talk about it is that, when it comes to back to this question of technology, is so many people think tech is this sort of engineer question, right? But really the way we make products these days is there's UX design, customer experience design, there's all these other different layers. But the thing that I want to, one point that I want to sort of have you remember here is that we need to decenter tech and design. And this kind of runs across all of this utopic solutionism, saying that, you know, design thinking will save us, right? And Elon Musk will save us. But meanwhile, how are we dealing with all these other issues in our cities? You know, the political economy, you know, what type of political economy is best for this planet, a finite planet, right? There's all these other ideas about zero growth, degrowth, right? Limits to growth, and how to live in a closed loop system, right? So another thing that I've sort of tried to map out here is kind of, again, getting political. Like, let's be culturally specific about what are all these different initiatives. So here's a sort of 2x2 grid that I made that does not have the libertarian grid. So a lot of the political grids that you see out there where there's like the opposite of authoritarianism is libertarianism. Guess who made that grid? You know, that's been fooling a lot of people into thinking what that is, when the reality is, you know, a lot of libertarianism is a bedfellow to authoritarianism. And I think that's what we've just seen with the sort of Republican and Trump complex, you know, that has done what it's doing. It's doing what it's doing, right? So how do we wake up from that? So in my book, the sort of top-down design, you know, expert approach and the transactional and technocratic and low context approach is pretty much squarely what so much of the smart city and big tech consciousness is about. Versus if you look at what is really community-based and participatory and is coming from a more ethical, humanistic, contextual, or what I would consider the wiser quadrant here, are these different sorts of community tech efforts, like what's happening with like Allied Media out of Detroit, you know, small efforts and similar efforts in Amsterdam, you know, in the Netherlands. There's very different constructs of relationships to technology and equity and power and politics in other cultures and regions. Same in Latin America with the social urbanism movement and the civic tech there. Like with the architecture in South America, there's an inherent assumption that it has to be dealing with social outcomes. That is less of a debate and more of a challenge of how do we maximize that and make that a core part of it. So I don't have answers really here. What I'm trying to do is just bring up a lot of questions that are in your mind. I want to destabilize, decenter, deconstruct so many of the things that you've maybe have been taught by your bosses, by your professors, by commercials during the Super Bowl, and sci-fi movies and whatnot, right? That have sort of, you know, fueled so many dreams of what is this exciting thing that we're dealing with in tech. And I'll end here with this slide, which is, you know, there's this sort of reactionary tendency in some to say, yeah, we agree that there's this, you know, we need to not have the hubris of the Zuckerberg, you know, sort of Silicon Valley mentality of moving fast and breaking things. And then people said, yeah, let's move slowly and fix things. But that tends to be an incrementalist attitude. And some things need to be that way. But there is another way to do that, which is what sort of impact can we make and what sort of exponential reality can we make when we are including all the bodies in our cities and cultures, and be more holistic and use different paradigms than the economic and political paradigms that we've inherited. So thank you for listening. I'll stop now. And I haven't been looking at the chat or anything, so I'm curious to see what ideas have come into your minds, and I look forward to having a nice conversation. Shruti.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. I just want to make a quick note that we will take this probably to about 6:10. If you need to hop off before, feel free, but that way we'll have, just so everybody's kind of got a better sense of timing.
So thank you, Daniel. That was amazing. Like what you said really brought back like Stockholm and Malmo and all those endeavors of sharing cities that go on, and like how we can kind of use those things to make a more social entrepreneurial endeavors that can help us here. But one thing that really comes to my mind is as we're thinking about this post-pandemic world, and like I know I'm being very optimistic here right now, but like of course there is like a reshuffling in neighborhoods, right? And then there's some element of lack of social cohesion because of that, because a lot of people moved. And so I was wondering if you could speak to like how can these practices which you mentioned can help engage the fellow citizens to make the community stronger. And also because the situation is so fragile, how do we deal with the misinformation and disinformation which you spoke about also, that have the potential to erode confidence in the placemaking endeavors? How do you think that you will be, I mean, whatever you feel would be relevant to this, would be a relevant strategy here?
Yeah, wow, okay. Two really good questions. So I'll actually share last night during the Wise City Wednesdays, and I've been experimenting with Clubhouse and having this every week, this weekly Wise City Wednesdays chat. Last night was interesting. Mitchell Silver, who is New York City's Parks Commissioner, joined the chat. And there was also a good handful of Canadian urbanists, placemakers that joined. And we talked about this, what is it going to look like coming out of the pandemic? And one of the things where we sort of ended up in that conversation was we really need to think about this differently than what it was like 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, there was after the Spanish influenza, there was the Roaring 20s. And there's already been numerous articles that have come out saying like, there's this sort of like salivating for like the economic benefit of that and the sort of hedonistic, like let's party, right? But what followed the Roaring 20s was World War II and the rise of fascism. And all of us have I feel a lot of us feel very freaked out by the history repeating itself situation that we're in. But yet we have way more powerful technologies of surveillance and weapons than we did 100 years ago. So I only feel kind of like giddy and light about it because of my nervousness about the severity of this issue. Like part of my bodily reaction right now is a sort of giddy, like I don't want to get serious about it because it's so heavy and dark, and weighty and challenging. So we're in this beautiful conversation that we had last night that went for 2.5 hours until like 10:15 Eastern time. We were talking about like this post-pandemic reality needs to really kind of think about it as integration. Like if you think about, there's all this work coming out of like plant medicine and in the trauma therapy. How do you integrate when you're going through a healing process or you've gone through trauma? What is the integration? And there's skills for that, but how do we do that together? Group integration, right? So what sort of, things can be done in the Parks Department to offer and program and through hybrid uses, because people are now like, hey, the social audio and other things, Zoom, there's so many different ways to kind of, there's more of a willingness now to have like these hybrid online, offline things. And, my friend, Scott Hefferman, who's the CEO and founder of Meetup, he always likes to call it, his sort of life mission is how do we use online technology for offline, connection, for offline action. So we've long resonated with each other about that, because that's very much what I would be asking the question of. So that I think is going to be key, is like there needs to be more of us in the sort of leaderfulness now that we've all discovered, in all the amazing facilitation upskilling that so many of us have added to under our belts because of all the Zoom conversations that have required more tight facilitation collectively by everybody. how can we, in a leaderful way, be wiser instead of just going back to, fuck it, let's party. And then, so the second question, disinformation. I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been really finding huge inspiration by all the research from journalists and sociologists on conspirituality, which is the sort of thing that relates to what's been fueling QAnon. And the intentional, weaponization of social media to divide and conquer us, and the thing there is certainly there's this question of, again, back to the individualism or the cyber libertarianism and the sort of fundamentalism about free speech and framing that differently, that is focused on, harm reduction. So again, there's a lot of wisdom that's been developing within the substance abuse and therapeutic, realms about harm reduction. And I think, there's an analogy there because all of this technology itself is like, it's better to sometimes think about it as a very powerful drug, a largely unregulated, incredibly toxic, powerful drug. There's so much more to talk about on that. Like we could have a whole session just about disinformation and urbanism.
So feel free to raise your hand here and ask question, unmute yourself and ask your questions. If not, I have more questions. Yeah.
I had a general comment. I don't know how familiar you are with the works of Lewis Mumford, but I kind of feel like his discussion on biotechnics versus megatechnics is like lying square in kind of the issue that you're talking about. But I'm kind of curious, like when you talk about kind of, are you familiar with Mumford's discussion on? Okay,
I'm not a scholar of Mumford, but
I'm not either. I'm just, I'm loosely. Everyone reads a little bit of planning theory, right? And so, but like the general idea of kind of basing our planning and our thought processes around human values, and around human bodies, frankly, is. I think what a lot of us who have seen the technological scene evolve, I know I'm coming from the space of, I'm a consultant. I do work in a project-based context. I do work with data tools that are, often seen as top-down metrics and ways of doing things, but I see them as using them to guide people towards the goals that they've articulated. Rather than necessarily defining those goals. And so I guess my question is do you have any advice for people in a project-based context for how we could set up processes that are, I think, the type of participatory iterative processes that you want to see that define placemaking?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of framing this, this question of data as being it's really important to distinguish being data-led or data-driven, which is, again, that's the uber technocratic framing, versus I think a wiser framing is to be data-informed.
I say the same thing. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's huge. Again, when you take that seriously versus just using that tokenistically and still being, right, a complete technocrat. The other thing too is there's a sort of like hammer, dimension where we have this powerful, analytics and data capturing, technologies and all sorts of accoutrements for that. And the question, again, this goes back to the media ecology rubrics like McLuhan and whatnot, and some of the other media ecologists and media studies folks, which is like, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve and whose problem is it? And oftentimes that isn't really given that much time. It's often it's out of assumption, or it's intentionally bypassed. And then it's like, hey, well, we've got this hammer, so let's sell people hammers, and who has got nails, or let's convince people that they have nails that need hammering. This rubs into all of the issues about private contracting, and a lack of governance about procurement. I want to plug again Bianca Wiley. I just saw a paper. I haven't read it, but I scanned over it, where they're looking at redefining procurement as a way to define value. So if in that rubric that I was showing, like the different squares of the different layers of assessment in our work, she's doing with some other colleagues the real like hard work of spelling all that out and looking at procurement as, hey, here's how we get to define the value of these different things in our cities, and in that then in a deep way of what we mean by value, not just economically. So there's I'll send a link, I'll tweet out a link to that so it's at the top of my feed, and send it to Olivia and Shruti for dissemination in other ways.
That'd be great. No, sorry, never mind.
Yeah, I see that Scott has his hand up.
Scott, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, or wanted to hear you talk a little more about what you called copy-paste culture. You know, and I like that sort of framing of it. I see how the projects that often would have a lesson that they would do differently, like I said with the High Line, they would do something differently if it was, if they were going to start again, they learned lessons. But then, you know, all of that idea of like whatever the lessons are that are learned from the project are often not brought into those next phases at the next, you know, when we have a culture where someone is government and funding and things like that are often focused on replicating proven projects.
Yep.
And things that have you know, a track record of success before we're managed to get funding, especially when that funding tends to come from more centralized sources like state and federal sources. It makes it a lot harder to incorporate, you know, the local nuances that really make it a placemaking project. So like what types of strategies do you think you know, practitioners on the ground should use to approach looking for funding and trying to find projects?
Can you clarify, like, what is the challenge that you're wanting advice on? Can you just rephrase that for me?
I mean, I'm mostly thinking about how to get projects funded, how to get things off the ground, and then what are the challenges to creating something that maybe is a shadow or an echo of something that exists. So you can share a vision and inspiration, but then also get those projects created.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of the dilemmas is you're in the US? Or...
Yeah. I actually run a bid in Queens.
Oh, okay, cool. So this is, so funding, you know, we have the nonprofit industrial complex, and one of the big other sort of systemic, we've got so many systemic issues that we're dealing. Program officers, program managers in a lot of foundations, they don't have the domain knowledge, you know, for a lot of this stuff. And so they often just go along, they go with the flow with whatever is the sort of prevailing best practice or ideas, or the constraints, the political constraints of that foundation. And then there's just the perennial problem of like, well, you know, let's just copy whatever the New York Times or Forbes or whatever, you know, planning magazine, you know, just talked about, right? So it really requires, I think the short answer is you need to think of your funding as a campaign, as like an activism campaign, your funding approach, because you always need to be educating people along the way in the way that you're asking for money or seeking money. And so it puts all that labor, you know, on those who have the least resources. This is the current dilemma. This is part of our current dysfunction. But here we are. So building that literacy for why, you know, like what the High Line, you know, what they've done is they've set up an education, like a university, because there's been like runaway copy paste of the High Line type thing in contexts that make absolutely no sense, but they get funded because people think the solution is the object, not the specific social, human reality of Chelsea, right? So they've set up an education, like a Highline University, where their mission now is to basically sort of undo and just spend a lot of time educating people about the way that they should have done it and the way they would like to do it. And it's really more of a process. It's an approach for engagement, to find the unique, to get the most impact. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
We are approaching 7:10. I think we're over by 10 minutes. So we can wrap up. Thank you everybody for attending this. It was amazing. Thank you, Daniel, for the lecture. Olivia, if you want to say parting words.
I'm just grateful for everyone's attention here. This sort of wisdom approach is not popular, but there's a reason why you stuck through this entire time of me, farting through my mouth. And, I don't have the answers, but I think collectively, when our hearts are in it and we're really coming from a right place, collectively through organizing together, we can come up with what we need. So I look forward to seeing the work that you guys are doing, to connecting online, to keep this going through the different channels. And feel free to ask me any questions or email me. I try to make myself as available as possible within my own resource limits.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And we'll be sure to circulate your contacts if we're, at least within the committee sphere. So hopefully we can join your clubhouse.
Yeah.
Is that the correct terminology? Clubhouse?
Clubhouse is the app. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's so the way I made it easy is, hashtag Wise City Wednesdays. And it is currently, I'm testing it on Clubhouse. But like what I was saying, like all of these apps are like Zuccotti Park. They're privately owned public spaces. There is no real good online space for anybody. So if you don't feel comfortable giving your entire address book to Clubhouse, but maybe you've already done that on LinkedIn or WhatsApp or any of the other apps where that's happened accidentally or on purpose. I'm really excited for Twitter Spaces, which is going to launch openly, publicly, imminently. And I think a lot more of us have our networks there. So just follow the hashtag on Twitter, and you'll see where each week's conversation will end up being. And I'm looking to kind of grow that then to after, sort of as we all get vaccinated, to also doing a mixture of in-person events as well.
Awesome. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.